The pen felt weightless in my hand as I inscribed my signature onto the divorce settlement, a gesture as detached and mechanical as any ledger entry I'd recorded in another lifetime. No sorrow flooded through me. No fear seized my throat. The hollow despair everyone anticipated never materialized. My husband sat mere meters away, barely containing his triumph, grinning like a man who just collected winnings he didn't deserve. He genuinely believed he'd stripped me bare. The irony was exquisite. He'd actually handed me something he could never reclaim. The courtroom exhaled that particular staleness, aged parchment mingling with bitter coffee, the unmistakable scent of a place where people come to dismantle everything they've built. I occupied my chair in a navy blazer purchased for interviews I never attended, hands positioned in my lap precisely as mother had trained me since childhood. Across the aisle, Benjamin Foster embodied a man already inhabiting his victory, adorned in charcoal tailoring from the establishment on Fifth Avenue, his fingers barely restraining themselves from his mobile phone, where undoubtedly he was composing messages to Diane, describing how imminent his triumph had become. He was acquiring the residence, that sprawling property with the wraparound veranda I'd once selected paint swatches for when redecorating still resembled constructing rather than adorning someone else's monument. Foster Construction was his to retain, the enterprise I'd sustained through consecutive economic collapses, utilizing spreadsheets he never bothered examining. The countryside retreat, the securities portfolio, both vehicles, every account bearing our intertwined names after 22 years as partners, all his. I received custody of two 17-year-old individuals, positioned 6 months before their departure to university, 6 months before requiring neither me nor my guardianship anymore. Olivia Hart, my solicitor, leaned toward me as proceedings commenced. She'd contested my intentions for 3 weeks following my initial disclosure, her bewilderment palpable. A 40-year veteran of client advocacy, unable to comprehend why I'd methodically demolish my own position with such steadfast composure. "Natalie," she murmured, pen suspended above her pad as though additional seconds might permit intervention. "You mustn't proceed with this." I met her gaze and articulated genuinely, "That's precisely why I am." She remained puzzled. So did the courtroom's occupants, with perhaps one exception. Whoever had drafted a particular document 17 years prior, never communicating its eventual significance. Judge Ramirez, a woman approaching her 60s with spectacles perched low across her nose, possessed that flattened expression of one who'd observed countless iterations of this scenario. She examined me across her documents with cautious recognition, the manner one observes someone positioned dangerously near a precipice. "Mrs. Foster," she pronounced, "I require confirmation of your comprehension regarding this agreement. You're relinquishing claims to virtually every matrimonial possession, including the primary dwelling, commercial entity, and investment holdings." "Correct." "Yes, Your Honor," I answered. "You've obtained adequate representation. You've allowed yourself contemplation time." "I have." "This arrangement proceeds voluntarily, absent any external pressure." "It does." Benjamin's frame shifted, and I detected it, that infinitesimal movement at his mouth's corner, the smile barely surfacing. Victory had come without combat, he believed. His spouse of 2 decades had merely exhausted her resolve, equivalent to water trickling from fractured vessel. His mother, positioned behind him in the gallery wearing her finest pearls, caught my attention momentarily. She bestowed that identical expression, the perpetual smile suggesting her long-standing conviction that I'd never truly sufficed for her offspring. Benjamin's signature came swiftly, excessively swiftly, the way individuals autograph items they've already mentally expended. I observed his pen's movement and contemplated our initial apartment, 400 square feet suspended above a laundromat, where he'd slumber with his skull resting upon my abdomen whilst I managed his paternal company's accounts by lamplight. I contemplated how extensively someone travels from their former identity and how seldom they notice the distance, until confronted with a mirror. The magistrate acknowledged satisfaction and extended her grasp toward the subsequent folder, one I recognized by its substantial weight, documentation residing in Olivia's portfolio since Tuesday. She parted it gradually, perused the initial page, then examined it once more. Benjamin remained inattentive initially, already mentally departing, composing correspondence regarding dinner reservations. His mother perceived the judge's facial transformation first, that delicate furrow manifest between her brows, and I witnessed Diane's smile falter for perhaps the initial occasion in 17 years. "Mr. Foster," the magistrate articulated deliberately, "are you cognizant of documentation submitted to this tribunal designated the Whitfield Family Trust?" Benjamin's composure evaporated instantaneously. "I beg your pardon," he uttered. I remained motionless. My palms found their position and something crystallized within my chest, a sensation I hadn't experienced in years, not precisely victory, something more subdued, approaching tranquility. Yet comprehending why I surrendered everything I'd constructed, why I positioned myself in that chamber, permitting my husband conviction of his own superiority, necessitates regression. Not merely this morning or even this annum, but approximately 3 years backward to a financial institution's correspondence, I was never meant to encounter, and an undertaking my grandfather pledged me prior to my grasping its expenditure or deliverance. People perpetually question how matrimony progresses from commencement to termination, as if one identifiable instant exists, one threshold slamming definitively. There isn't one. Only an extended corridor of diminishing passages, closing sequentially with such quietude that you remain unaware, until rotating around and recognizing you're enveloped in obscurity. I encountered Benjamin Foster at age 24, freshly credentialed in accounting, investing 60-hour increments at a mid-scale accounting establishment in Charlotte. He was 26, commanding a vehicle with fractured glass and independently produced business cards from a reproduction shop. Foster Construction, dependable workmanship, equitable pricing. 2 employees, both siblings, and a previously owned concrete apparatus still being remitted. His footwear bore construction dust, yet his ocular contact conveyed you constituted existence's solitary inhabitant. I surrendered to that expression prior to surrendering to anything else concerning him. We exchanged vows 18 months subsequently within my parents' garden, folding seating arrangements and decorative illumination. Within annum, I was calculating his ledgers at my kitchen table following my employment's conclusion. I fashioned his billing methodology. I resubmitted his contractor authorization renewals thrice consecutively because he perpetually overlooked deadlines. I arranged discussions with his initial lending institution regarding credit accommodation when insufficient collateral existed independently, arriving with personally constructed projections binders, conversing regarding mathematics with a loan consultant whose attention maintained fixing toward Benjamin despite my presence, as though accurate comprehension should originate from his direction. The individual comprehending cash allocation was myself. Benjamin comprehended concrete composition and structural assembly and interpreting collections of subcontractors, essential capabilities I perpetually honored. Nevertheless, enterprises don't endure exclusively through construction methodology. They persist via the operative managing illumination when benefactors sustain 60-day payment delays, the person administering compensation during economically sluggish periods, the person declining the pickup apparatus he preferred because mathematical projections lack justification. That operative was myself. Across practically 1 decade, uninvested, unlisted, undesignated, except within revenue documentation. Subsequently, the pair arrived. I recollect cradling Ethan in singular appendage and Emma in the alternative within the healthcare facility, depleted in manners my physiology hadn't previously comprehended, whilst Benjamin positioned himself in the threshold, already conversing telephonically with procurement professionals regarding assignment timelines. I didn't begrudge it at that moment. I convinced myself it constituted his fundamental personality, an individual incapable of remaining stationary, someone whose consciousness perpetually occupied positions 3 measurements forward. I traversed homeward. I nourished 2 neonates throughout nocturnal intervals, and incrementally, absent deliberate determination, I discontinued direct workplace participation. The corporation expanded whilst I remained divorced from its accounting operations, because Benjamin had recruited an authentic accounting specialist named Karen, an individual who described him as visionary within transmitted messages I occasionally witnessed across his shoulder. He commenced garnering recognition within regional commercial periodicals. Foster Construction Originator transforms family enterprise into metropolitan prominence. I perused that composition whilst standing within my kitchen bearing infant nutrition upon my garment, without representation mentioned throughout 4 columns of typography. Absolutely nowhere, not peripherally. The separation didn't materialize abruptly. It materialized sequentially. He commenced arriving home progressively later, perpetually offering justification, customer engagement, bureaucratic complication demanding his intervention. He commenced making pecuniary determinations independently of prior notification. Determinations I merely recognized upon correspondence arrival. He established accounts remaining unknown to me. He discontinued requesting my perspective. Diane contributed to the deterioration. She'd materialize during Sunday gatherings and articulate Benjamin's prosperity as though manifesting independently from his individual appendages, as if he'd assembled something magnificent from absolute nothing except determination and predestined capability. My offspring constructed all this personally, she articulated once, rotating her beverage, glancing at me similarly to the way one observes domestic personnel who have strayed excessively proximate to significant crockery. I never contradicted her. Never. I convinced myself factuality required no spectators to preserve authenticity. I maintained silence throughout most occurrences. That constituted my essence, someone observing predominantly in preference to communicating, considering dignity as refraining from creating disturbances, even as the disturbance constructed itself encompassing me progressively. I convinced myself Benjamin experienced exhaustion, that prosperity had rendered him inattentive, that the individual who'd formerly rested with his head upon my abdomen persisted somewhere, entombed beneath contractual obligations and professional ambition. Subsequently arrived an autumn afternoon, roughly 3 years prior, when I was organizing correspondence, predominantly statements and educational announcements, and I encountered an envelope from an unfamiliar financial establishment, addressed to Benjamin, designated confidential in scarlet lettering. I nearly disregarded it, nearly permitted it to remain upon his workspace, unopened, equivalent to innumerable previous envelopes. I didn't. I unfastened it alternatively. What lay within wasn't correspondence from an institution whatsoever. It constituted verification documentation from a confidential investment advisory organization positioned in Boston, regarding Benjamin, describing a portfolio restructuring already finalized. I perused it repeatedly before language achieved comprehension, then once more whilst the unpleasant sensation fully consolidated within my abdomen. Benjamin had relocated resources, considerable resources, into sequences of proprietary holdings I'd never encountered, enterprises bearing nomenclature like Meridian Equity and Ashford Collective entities that appeared to subsist exclusively for detaching possessions from matrimonial connection through documentation, substantially before any dissolution had ever been contemplated. I didn't address it that afternoon. I contained it alternatively, equivalent to how I'd learned containing most circumstances, reflecting upon it while preparing cuisine, supplementing Emma with chemistry assistance, attending to Ethan's coaching grievances. I contacted an acquaintance from my accounting profession, a forensic audit specialist named Priya, owing me historical consideration, and questioned her deliberately whether someone commenced restructuring possessions whilst remaining unaware. It indicates, Priya articulated, he's either fortifying against litigation or fortifying himself regarding you. I already comprehended which alternative it was. Throughout subsequent weeks, I examined threads discreetly, equivalent to how I formerly traced inconsistencies in accounting, never expressing objectives, merely adhering to numerical records until reality crystallized. Benjamin had commenced procedure 18 lunar periods previously, immediately following Diane's commencement of introducing him as practically unrestricted, given the offspring's imminent independence. He'd sustained an intimate involvement for practically 1 solar year with an individual designated Kristen, component of his enterprise's commercial personnel. though substantiation remained unavailable, merely an intuition I'd been repressing for durations. That particular sensitivity spouses cultivate when they discontinue receiving dinner inquiries. I contemplated the infidelity extensively. Nights when I expelled tears within the lavatory whilst operating ventilation mechanisms preventing juvenile recognition. Nights when I remained wakeful, the accountant within me perpetually recalculating, refusing permitting the spouse within me to disintegrate thoroughly. I perpetually reflected upon years expended constructing his operation from transportation apparatus and aspiration into something appearing within professional publications. Years he now methodically guaranteed I'd possess no legitimate compensation for. During one of those sleepless intervals, I remembered my grandfather. Walter W.H. Itfield constituted a composed individual, an unoccupied jurist who expended his concluding 15 intervals pursuing aquatic leisure within Michigan and consuming economical literature upon his veranda. Upon his expiration, I was 28, newly conjugated, firmly believing in existence I was engineering. He'd bequeathed me something within his testament, a conservatorship endowed modestly initially, containing equities and a diminutive territorial parcel, organized as his personal attorney designated as irrevocable conservatorship. I recollect authenticating documentation within his solicitor's workplace, partially attentive, distracted via Benjamin's communication regarding procurement complication. I recollect my grandfather securing my appendage, subsequently, and articulating something I hadn't considered in extended intervals. This isn't for prosperous intervals, Natalie. This constitutes contingency for if demanding intervals arrive. I hadn't perused that conservatorship documentation in 10+ intervals. I wasn't even particular I maintained it. Nevertheless, something within my subconscious, some tranquil architecture my grandfather had constructed for me substantially prior to recognition of necessity, communicated significance presently. I positioned the documentation within a thermally insulated receptacle within my upper story, beneath historical financial records and Ethan and Emma's juvenile publications. 41 pages saturated with vocabulary I hadn't examined since academically preparing for heritage legislation assessment. I contacted Priya once more, and subsequently, utilizing her direction, an inheritance solicitor designated Olivia Hart, an individual featuring silver coiffure and notoriety for unwavering courtroom constancy. Olivia perused the conservatorship for practically 120 minutes within her workplace, whilst I occupied the alternative seating, observing her expressions transition from courteous objectivity into something substantially keener. "Comprehend what your grandfather fashioned for you?" she ultimately questioned. I articulated comprehension regarding rudimentary components, equities, territorial possession, unassuming inheritance. "It's appreciated," she communicated, substantially and substantially critically. "It's organized such that it distributes comprehensively if you reduce possession within matrimonial possessions. Your grandfather fashioned contingency, Natalie. He fashioned it presuming occasion might materialize when you possessed absolutely nothing remaining belonging to yourself." I remained stationary, equivalent to how I'd become proficient at remaining stationary throughout my partnership. Except this instance wasn't distress maintaining composure. It constituted progressive comprehension of something entirely divergent, something experiencing substantially less resemblance to panic and substantially greater resemblance, for the initial duration in extended intervals, like planetary geology shifting, determinedly underneath my extremities once more. Benjamin had expended 18 lunar periods, guaranteeing I'd traverse dissolution, possessing absolutely nothing. He didn't comprehend that traversing with absolutely nothing would immediately constitute me substantially wealthier than he'd contemplated feasible. Olivia Hart disliked my strategy. She communicated so explicitly within her workplace, whilst we contemplated the conservatorship documentation dispersed equivalent to playing apparatus. "You could contend for fractional possession," she articulated. "The dwelling, commercial valuation, possession portfolios. Contemplating his deeds, asset repositioning absent notification, a judge wouldn't admire him. You could traverse with substantial resources, Natalie, and persist conserving your conservatorship untouched. Why would you relinquish confrontation you'd probably overcome? I comprehended her bewilderment. Theoretically, it demonstrated illogic. I could have engaged forensic accounting specialists tracing each monetary unit Benjamin relocated, inserted the partnership into judicial examination, expended 2 intervals engaging in contestation, hemorrhaging him monetarily and psychologically, equivalent to he apparently organized to hemorrhage myself. Olivia had constructed her comprehensive lifetime on precisely that classification of confrontation, and she demonstrated excellence. Extraordinary excellence. Nevertheless, I didn't require his possession. I required something he couldn't determine, couldn't anticipate, couldn't construct defensive strategy regarding because he wouldn't even comprehend it manifested until already experiencing its detriment. Should I have contested for fractional matrimonial property, I'd expend intervals tethered to him via attorneys and valuations and courtroom appointments. Even post-contest, I'd merely achieve equivalent prosperity to what his operation created. Should I traverse relink? Wishing and permitting the conservatorship execute what my grandfather fashioned, I'd experience freedom diverging from him thoroughly and prosperity exceeding the enterprise he'd taken satisfaction in throughout his existence. I communicated to Olivia. I comprehended the situation appeared like psychological deterioration. Nevertheless, she must believe me equivalent to I trusted what my grandfather fashioned. It required her 3 discussions before accepting, and I'm uncertain she completely accepted. I wouldn't retract the morning of examination. She submitted documentation as I requested. She maintained the conservatorship notification, separated and isolated from comprehensive dissolution submission, specifically as statute permitted, introduced exclusively subsequent to settlement conclusion within tribunal. Subsequent to Benjamin's inscription, was currently permanent on documentation he couldn't rescind. Domestically, I disclosed nothing. Not my sister, not my intimate companion from worship venue. Not even Ethan and Emma, though they possessed sufficient maturity interpreting something was deteriorating substantially prior to clarification. Benjamin, conversely, experienced unparalleled delight. He transferred from our dwelling in November into metropolitan accommodation. He portrayed to Diane as provisional. Nevertheless, I recognized the provisional quarters contained ornamentation within 14-day intervals. He commenced materializing at offspring basketball participation, with Kristen sequencing him marginally, her appendage secured within his akin to she'd previously assessed our previous residence's textile selections. He procured contemporary transportation apparatus, not from requirement, merely from capability. From initially encountering circumstances, the prior 2 decades, he wasn't presenting mathematics calculations via myself. Diane accepted me to nutritional engagement, throughout that duration theoretically examining offspring's academic preparations. Nevertheless, I comprehended within the initial 100 minutes, it constituted audition regarding her prospective function as the pragmatic matriarch, expediting matters. Benjamin constructed that enterprise from absolute nothing. She communicated, tempering sweetening within her beverage. Dismantling it within tribunal wouldn't constitute equity. I'm certain you grasp. I communicated I comprehended, substantially more than she suspected, and permitted her decoding it whatever manners she selected. The complexity wasn't Benjamin. It wasn't even Diane. It constituted Ethan and Emma observing their matriarch surrendering the solely dwelling they'd ever occupied absent resistance. Observing matrimonial documentation get inscribed premise by premise, whilst their patriarch celebrated equivalent to someone who'd escaped confrontation. Emma positioned herself within my kitchen 1 interval. Lease documentation for our coming quarters, positioned upon the counter, and she articulated the inquiry I recognized she'd been containing for weeks. Mum, why aren't you battling? Everybody comprehends what he committed. Everybody comprehends regarding her. I positioned my inscription implement and contemplated my girl, 17 intervals existing, currently substantially more discerning than myself at that maturation. I communicated the exclusive reality I could communicate without revealing the comprehensive strategy. Sometimes succeeding doesn't appear like battling, Emma. Sometimes it appears like permitting someone think they've currently succeeded. She didn't comprehend. I didn't anticipate comprehension, not immediately. Ethan remained more restrained concerning it. Nevertheless, I identified him contemplating me certain intervals, exhibiting uneasiness, typically conserved for progenitors examining offspring, not alternative positioning, and it fractured something diminutive within myself each instance. Subsequent to the tribunal timeframe coming in primitive springtime, Benjamin had presently designated an engagement device for Kristen, per a cousin sustaining communicative connection with me via antiquated allegiance. He'd commenced designing an expansion upon the countryside quarters he was immediately possessing entirely. He traversed into that tribunal equivalent to someone traversing into commemoration. He was particular was being executed for his admiration. Realigning his garment, barely regarding myself, already partially positioned into his subsequent existence. He didn't comprehend that following existence was about to appear completely divergent from his preparation. We've regressed to our commencement position, the tribunal exhaling aged documentation and economical beverage. Judge Ramirez containing a portfolio she hadn't anticipated unsealing. Permit me positioning you within that instant, because everything transpiring subsequently materialized within insufficient than 160 intervals, although experiencing it constit. Uded comparable to observing building demolition distributed, individual structural tier at individual tier. Benjamin had inscribed absolutely everything. The dwelling, the enterprise, the possession portfolios, absolutely everything, notarized and confirmed with straightforward assurance constituting person finalizing agreement he'd imaginatively expended repeatedly. His advocate, a perceptive individual designated Cole Bennett, compensated temporal increments and clearly communicated this would constitute swift, unopposed examination, position beside him appearing similarly composed, already examining his chronometer. Judge Ramirez had progressed through the contract with expeditious competency, handling 100+ matrimonial dissolutions, each interval, until encountering the portfolio Olivia had submitted independently from comprehensive contract documentation. I monitored her carriage modification, examining, records the manner someone's appendages square, upon grasping scheduled responsibility, has transformed into something fundamentally different. Mr. Foster, she communicated, positioning the portfolio downward. Comprehend you of documentation submitted to this tribunal-designated Whitfield conservatorship. Benjamin's appearance accomplished something I'd never experienced throughout 22 intervals of partnership. It developed vacant, subsequently baffled, subsequently something bordering frightened. "Excuse me," he articulated once more, regarding his advocate, who was presently examining documentation sequences containing noticeably escalating consternation. Olivia positioned herself composed equivalent to motionless aquatic and communicated with the tribunal. "Your Honor, this conservatorship was fashioned by Mrs. Foster's posthumous patriarch exceeding 17 intervals prior. It constitutes irrevocable conservatorship, thoroughly catalogued, thoroughly independent from matrimonial property. Compliant with constitutional and geographical statute, its possessions get excluded from matrimonial property. We submitted formal notification of the conservatorship's existence with this tribunal, however not with contesting advocacy, as it wasn't mandated for the contract getting entered presently, considering Mrs. Foster wasn't pursuing compensation regarding it." Cole Bennett was perusing substantially quicker at this moment, his professional comportment fragmenting peripherally. "Your Honor, should this conservatorship get activating via matrimonial dissolution terminology, we'd require interval examining," he communicated. The conservatorship's triggering mechanism, Olivia continued untroubled, became activated the instant Mrs. Foster relinquished possession within matrimonial possessions this morning, precisely as she's executed volitionally, equivalent to this tribunal confirmed intervals previously. No tribunal participation becomes mandated for it being implemented. It constitutes confidential apparatus executed independently of these proceedings. I positioned stationary through absolutely it. My appendages positioned similarly they'd positioned hourly formerly, though something within my breast had loosened equivalent to maintained breathing ultimately discharged. I didn't regard Benjamin. I didn't require observation. I could perceive him regarding myself from across the chamber, and within that perception, I could perceive every inquiry he wasn't yet comprehending how formulating. The magistrate reversed her examination regarding him. Mr. Foster, I'll request you explicitly. Did you possess awareness preceding inscription presently regarding existence or terminology of this conservatorship? Benjamin's oral aperture unsealed, shut, unsealed once more. No, he ultimately articulated, his communication substantially smaller than I'd previously experienced it. I didn't comprehend. Did anybody conceal this correspondence regarding you? Was it withheld throughout examination? Olivia reacted prior to him receiving opportunity. No, Your Honor. This conservatorship was never incorporated within Mrs. Foster's disclosed matrimonial property because it isn't and hasn't ever been matrimonial property. Mr. Foster experienced no obligation inquiring about possession belonging independently to his spouse, and Mrs. Foster experienced no obligation communicating regarding property transcending these proceedings' parameters. The magistrate perused between ourselves for an extended instant, subsequently examining the documentation once more. This contract was entered volitionally from both participants possessing suitable advocacy, and I discern no substantiation of deception regarding the matrimonial property itself. She regarded Benjamin, not unkindly, nevertheless with crystalline plainness constituting someone communicating information. Mr. Foster, I comprehend this constitutes surprise experience, nevertheless surprise doesn't equate to deception. You inscribed this. Contract possessing comprehensive comprehension of reception. Mrs. Foster isn't mandated clarifying what she previously possessed. I experienced something crumble within Benjamin's expression. That distinctive crumbling constituting someone comprehending temporally that the chronicle he'd been narrating throughout periodic intervals wasn't the chronicle that had genuinely materialized. He'd positioned into that tribunal positive, he was the individual acquiring absolutely everything. He was absolutely presently comprehending that certainty had manufactured him careless, and carelessness, ultimately, constitutes its classification of judgment. He positioned upward, so accelerated his seating, scraped violently, opposing the flooring. Benjamin's communication penetrated the tribunal prior to the magistrate could even demand procedure. This isn't legitimate, he articulated, his appendages stabilizing opposing the table equivalent to he required something concrete stabilizing him in position. She maintained this from myself. She approved me inscribing absent notification regarding what she possessed. Judge Ramirez didn't amplify her communication. Nevertheless, the tribunal went hushed the manor's chambers transform when someone in management basically disregards temperature increase. Mr. Foster, I'd recommend positioning and consulting your advocate prior to articulating additional, she communicated. Cole Bennett was presently extracting at his appendage, murmuring something demanding, nevertheless Benjamin didn't position. He revolved regarding myself immediately, something I hadn't anticipated. His comportment thoroughly disappeared, substituted via unvarnished disbelief constituting someone experiencing planetary geology evaporate underneath him. You comprehended, he articulated. Throughout this, you comprehended, and you permitted myself to think I was succeeding. I contemplated him, the individual I'd expended 22 intervals engineering existence with regarding the adolescent exhibiting construction dust and fractured glass, who'd previously rest with his skull resting upon my abdomen, presently positioned within premium tailoring, accusing myself of transgression I hadn't perpetrated. I never deceived you, Benjamin, I expressed, and my communication materialized steadier than I anticipated. You requested absolutely everything. I transmitted you absolutely everything you requested. He engaged fresh advocacy within intervals, someone possessing notoriety for combative responses, establishing they get the contract dismissed entirely. Nevertheless, Olivia had constructed the contract too meticulously for that accessibility to manifest. Each inscription was corroborated, every notification was legitimately appropriate, Each possession Benjamin obtained corresponded precisely to demands he'd communicated and contested throughout negotiation. The conservatorship wasn't disguised via deception. It straightforwardly was never his inquiring approximately, and ignorance, however bitter, was never becoming grounds to reverse agreement he'd participated, with ocular perception clear and conceit clearer yet. The conclusive judgment materialized 6 intervals subsequently. The magistrate dismissed his movement via composed judgment that Olivia recited via communication to myself, her communication possessing quiet gratification of advocate observing preparation she'd formerly doubted establish itself legitimate. Benjamin Foster wasn't misrepresented. Benjamin Foster had merely never formulated appropriate inquiries regarding partner he'd stopped perceiving as anything exceeding individual, who preserved his records and engineered his offspring. Diane positioned to encounter myself occurring adjacent completion, positioning upon my contemporary veranda wearing her ecclesiastical pearls. Nevertheless, her comportment had diminished substantially since preceding instants I'd experienced her. You could have cautioned him, she communicated. Not precisely grievance, not precisely different either. 22 intervals, Natalie, you could have transmitted something preceding he constructed such spectacle of himself. He manufactured spectacle of himself the instant he discontinued inquiring what I comprehended. I communicated. And for the initial interval in 17 intervals, Diane Foster possessed absolutely nothing transmitting to myself. The authentic comprehension, which I merely completely grasped throughout intervals succeeding, was that Benjamin hadn't genuinely engineered prosperity independently. He'd engineered enterprise, respectable, productive, prestigious. Nevertheless, enterprise isn't prosperity, not in manners that constitute importance. Prosperity constitutes what persists beyond you, what accumulates discreetly throughout experience whilst you're consuming yourself and everybody else that you performed it individually utilizing your personal appendages. My grandfather comprehended hat preceding I ever did. Positioned upon his Michigan veranda with his aquatic apparatus and economical literature, engineering something patient and defended for descendant, he suspected might eventually require defending from affection that looked steadier compared to it was. Benjamin maintained the enterprise. He maintained the dwelling, countryside property, possession portfolios, absolutely everything he'd contested so diligently to procure in tribunal. Theoretically, he'd succeeded at absolutely everything he'd requested. Nevertheless, I experienced throughout following intervals as that prosperity's expense showed progressively, the manor's expenses typically do. Kristen didn't continue subsequent she comprehended prosperity wasn't forthcoming. Subsequent she comprehended the individual she'd connected herself to possessed financial obligation regarding countryside property he'd expressed regarding, and enterprise that, absent my discreet administration throughout 2-decade intervals, was presently exhibiting fractures within payment distribution that contracted bookkeeper hadn't identified in appropriate intervals. Benjamin had engineered personality encircling being individual requiring nothing and absolutely nobody. And presently, throughout his preliminary occasion throughout his mature years, he was discovering precisely the measure of that personality that was authentic, and the measure of that personality that fundamentally was myself, positioned discreetly posterior to himself, guaranteeing he'd encounter nothing necessitating self-sufficiency. I traversed from tribunal that afternoon absent gazing posterior at the construction or the individual still contesting his advocate throughout the passageway. Ethan and Emma waited within my automobile, and subsequently I positioned myself within, Emma positioned across, and compressed my appendage absent communicating, equivalent to she'd ultimately comprehended something she hadn't intervals preceding. I preceded us domestically, as preliminary afternoon, positioned similar to metallic coating transversing the visibility. And throughout the initially extended intervals, the pathway forward didn't experience equivalent to something I was persisting through. It experienced equivalent to something that ultimately, discreetly, belonged to myself. 8+ intervals have passed subsequent to that afternoon within tribunal, and Benjamin persists possessing absolutely everything he battled so diligently to retain. The dwelling exhibiting the wraparound veranda, the enterprise with his nomenclature distributed via absolutely every apparatus, countryside property, automobiles, possession portfolios. He protected so thoroughly throughout our matrimonial dissolution, positive that maintaining them transmitted he'd succeeded. I never positioned posterior acquiring anything. I never desired. There's distinctive liberty in relinquishing existence you engineered utilizing your appendages and permitting anybody else maintain the composition, because composition was never what I was battling regarding. The conservatorship commenced distributing resources, practically instantly subsequent settlement completed, precisely equivalent my grandfather fashioned it throughout preceding intervals ago. I didn't procure anything lavish. I positioned a diminutive dwelling 2 passages posterior to Maritime Embankment, within village 1 hour's distance, from where Ethan and Emma developed. Sufficient proximity permitting they could traverse domestically weekends. Sufficient distance producing it, experienced resembling commencing fresh as opposed to simply relocating from my antiquated existence. It comprises kitchen visibility, examining developing garden I'm incrementally mastering cultivation regarding. Certain intervals, I position myself with consuming beverage comprehending, I haven't contemplated Benjamin whatsoever. Not originating from acrimony diminishing, nevertheless from existence quietly completing surrounding myself alternatively. Ethan and Emma obtained recognition from respectable institutes this springtime. Emma pursues collegiate research regarding monetary science, which manufactured myself laugh the preliminary instance. She articulated positioning within my contemporary kitchen with recognition documentation in her appendage. Nevertheless, I'm uncertain. She thoroughly comprehended motivation, until I clarified marginally concerning her fantastic grandfather, and the conservatorship he'd fashioned regarding descendant, he wasn't existing to experience requirement regarding it. Ethan remains composed regarding his preparation, the manner he's perpetually been. Nevertheless, he contacts myself most ecclesiastical intervals. Communication extending compared to conversations we ever maintained existing underneath Benjamin's household, evaluating his terminology, meticulously encompassing his sire's tempers. Benjamin positioned outreach multiple occasions, throughout summer. Why intervals? No spectacle involved, predominantly coordination, regarding offspring's transition intervals. Nevertheless, one interval in July, he contacted regarding component else completely. I could perceive it throughout his communication preceding he'd articulated it, that distinctive shakiness of someone who'd expended intervals contemplating something and ultimately resolved articulating it audibly. You could have transmitted myself, he articulated, regarding the conservatorship. Previous everything transpiring. I positioned upon my contemporary veranda observing the concluding illumination disappearing across moisture I couldn't completely perceive from positioning, nevertheless could consistently perceive. I contemplated the quantity intervals I'd expended anticipating him formulating genuine inquiry. Genuine inquiry regarding my identification, or what I transmitted, or what I'd engineered discreetly beside himself whilst he procured recognition. You never requested, I articulated. Extended postponement manifested on the communication, that classification producing myself apprehensive previously as I still required his silences producing something peaceful. It didn't. So this was retribution, he ultimately articulated, not precisely inquiry. No, I transmitted him, and I articulated it substantially absolutely compared to I reckon he'll ever comprehend. I didn't execute this damaging yourself, Benjamin. I straightforwardly discontinued defending yourself regarding your personal acquisitiveness. What transpired subsequently was never something I could manipulate. He possessed zero reaction for that. We dismissed communication intervals subsequently. Courteous in manners, 2 individuals could be courteous subsequent. The battling was ultimately extracted from themselves. I positioned upon my veranda intervals afterward, attending to the sensation I couldn't precisely experience from positioning, nevertheless could perpetually comprehend. I contemplate Diane periodically, though substantially not anticipated. I comprehended via offspring that she's discontinued presenting Benjamin's prosperity as something he manufactured independently. Whether that's humility or merely exhaustion, I couldn't communicate, and I position myself no extended requirement comprehending. Individuals question myself periodically whether I experience remorse excluding battling substantially within tribunal, excluding maintaining fractional of absolutely everything I engineered throughout 22 intervals. I transmit them veracity. I didn't diminish that battle. I straightforwardly designated alternate battle. There exists positioning of fortitude, resembling contracted appendages, and tribunal combats. There's substitute positioning resembling discreetly inscribing your nomenclature, exiting the portal, and confidence that resources meriting possessing were perpetually things anybody could procure from yourself originally. My grandfather comprehended that. It required me practically my entirely existence achieving comprehension additionally. Should you're positioned somewhere presently experiencing equivalent to you've misplaced everything to someone who discontinued perceiving what you constituted importance regarding, I desire you receiving this. Sometimes optimum choice you're competent executing isn't battling for what constitutes possession of yours. It's believing that what genuinely belongs to you was perpetually something they weren't competent obtaining.